He didn't flinch when the cafe owner called him a drifter, didn't raise his voice when the harbor patrol nudged him along. He just tugged his cap lower, the faded Coast Guard emblem catching the morning light. Then a stranger's voice cut through the salty air. "Where'd you get that cap?" It wasn't a question. It was a reckoning. If you think their stories deserve to be heard, hit subscribe and comment legacy below. The wind off the Atlantic was sharp that morning, rattling the shutters of Pelican Point's only cafe, a weathered clapboard building called the Salty Gull. Elias Carver stepped inside, shaking salt spray from his peacoat, the kind of heavy wool that had seen decades of storms. At 78, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who'd spent his life on rolling decks, each step measured, each breath carrying the weight of the sea. His boots, scuffed but polished, thudded softly on the hardwood floor, leaving faint traces of sand. A faded blue cap sat low on his brow, its Coast Guard patch frayed at the edges, the stitching barely holding together. He carried no phone, no wallet, just a small leather notebook tucked in his pocket, its pages yellowed from years of handling. He nodded to the barista, a young woman named Tara with a nose ring and a distracted air, who barely looked up from her phone. "Coffee black," Elias said, his voice steady as a ship's keel, deep and resonant with a faint Maine accent that hadn't softened with time. He settled at a corner table by the window, facing the harbor where the Pelican Point lighthouse stood, its red and white stripes faded, but proud, its beacon long since automated. He came here every year on the anniversary of the '73 storm, when the sea had swallowed half the fishing fleet and spit out ghosts in its wake. No one noticed him much anymore. To the summer tourists snapping photos of the harbor, he was just another old man, lingering too long over a single cup, his presence as unremarkable as the gulls circling overhead. Tara whispered to the cafe owner, a wiry man named Greg Harper, who frowned as he wiped down the counter with a rag that smelled faintly of bleach. "He's back again," Greg muttered, his voice low but carrying in the quiet morning. "Sits there for hours, spooks the tourists with that stare of his. Doesn't even tip." He tapped his phone, checking the day's reservations, then called out, "Sir, we've got a 2-hour limit on tables. You'll need to move along soon." Elias sipped his coffee, unhurried, the steam rising in faint wisps against the cold glass of the window. "I'll be out of your way," he said, eyes still on the lighthouse, its silhouette framed by a gray sky threatening rain. He'd been coming here for 30 years, ever since the Coast Guard decommissioned the old keeper's post and replaced his lantern with a soulless electric bulb. He didn't argue, didn't explain. He just adjusted his cap, the patch catching Greg's eye for a moment, a brief flicker of curiosity, quickly dismissed, before Greg turned back to his counter. A few minutes later, a harbor patrol officer stepped inside, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. He was young, barely 30, with the kind of confidence that comes from a clipboard and a uniform, his boots squeaking on the floor as he walked. "Sir," he said, approaching Elias's table, "we've had reports of loitering. I'm going to need you to clear out." Elias looked up, his gray eyes calm but unyielding, the kind of gaze that had once steadied a crew in 20-foot swells. "I'm just having coffee," he said, his tone even, not a hint of defiance, but not an ounce of surrender either. The officer reached for his arm, grip firm, guiding him toward the door. Elias didn't resist, but as he stood, his sleeve caught on the chair, pulling back to reveal a faded tattoo on his forearm. An anchor, and the words, "Rescue 73. The ink blurred but unmistakable. A voice from the doorway stopped them cold. "Hold it right there." The cafe went quiet, the hum of the espresso machine the only sound. Standing in the entrance was a woman in a navy blazer, her posture straight as a mast, silver hair pulled back tight in a bun. A gold pin on her lapel glinted, a Coast Guard commander's insignia. She wasn't asking for attention. She commanded it, her presence filling the room like a sudden gust. Her eyes locked on Elias's cap, then his tattoo, narrowing as if she were reading a chart in a storm. "Where'd you get that ink?" she said, stepping closer, her boots clicking on the hardwood. Elias didn't answer right away. He studied her, searching for something in her face. Maybe a memory, maybe a ghost. "Earned it," he said finally, voice low, the words carrying the weight of a decade he rarely spoke of. A long time ago. Most days, Elias Carver was a shadow in Pelican Point, a small fishing town on the Maine coast where the air always smelled of salt and diesel. He lived in a clapboard house on the edge of town, perched on a cliff where the sea roared below, its windows rattling in the wind. He woke before dawn, boiled water in a kettle older than most of the town's summer visitors, the dented copper pot a relic from his keeper days. Then he'd walk the coastal path to the old lighthouse, a narrow trail of crushed shells and seagrass, the ocean on one side, the pines on the other. He didn't climb the tower anymore, too many stairs for his knees, which ached when the weather turned. But he'd sit on the rocks below, watching the waves crash against the jagged shore. No one knew he'd once kept that light burning through storms that tore boats apart, guiding fishermen home when the fog was so thick you couldn't see your own hands. No one asked about the nights he'd hauled men from the water, their lips blue, their eyes wild with fear, their hands clawing at his life preserver as he pulled them to safety. At the docks, he was just Old Carver, the guy who'd fix a net or patch a hole for a neighbor without asking for a dime, his hands still steady despite the arthritis creeping in. He didn't wear his service ribbons, didn't talk about the rescues unless someone pressed, and no one really pressed anymore. The only hints were the cap he never took off and the notebook he carried, filled with names and dates from '73. He'd written them down so he wouldn't forget. James Riley, 28, fisherman, saved. Clara Holt, 19, passenger, lost. Michael Dunn, 34, captain, saved. The list went on, a ledger of lives he'd touched. Some he'd saved, some he hadn't. He'd written each name in careful block letters, the ink smudged in places from salt water and time. Every year, on the anniversary of the storm, Elias came to the Salty Gull by the harbor. Not for the coffee, which was too weak for his taste, but for the view of the lighthouse. It was his ritual, his way of remembering, a quiet vigil for the ones he'd lost and the ones he'd brought home. He'd sit for hours, watching the waves, his mind drifting back to that night. The howl of the wind, the crack of splintering wood, the shouts of men in the dark. He could still hear Clara's scream as the ferry broke apart, her voice swallowed by the sea before he could reach her. He'd never forgiven himself for that one, though he'd pulled her brother Michael from the wreckage an hour later, the man's hands frozen around a piece of driftwood. This time, though, the staff didn't know him, or didn't care to. To them, he was just an old man taking up space, his cap too worn, his presence too quiet. They didn't see the weight he carried, the way his shoulders bore the memory of every life he'd touched. But someone else did, and she wore a commander's pin. The patrol officer let go of Elias's arm, stepping back, his clipboard dangling awkwardly at his side. The woman in the blazer moved closer, ignoring the stares from the cafe patrons, her eyes fixed on Elias. "You're Elias Carver," she said, not a question. "I'm Commander Lena Riley. My father was James Riley. You pulled him out of the water in '73. Elias's breath caught, a rare crack in his steady demeanor. He remembered James, a fisherman, barely conscious, clinging to a piece of wreckage in the middle of the storm. Elias had swum out in 20-foot swells, tied a line around him, and dragged him to the rescue boat, the waves crashing over them both. "Your father," Elias said softly, his voice rougher now, like gravel underfoot. "He was a tough one. Kept singing some old shanty to stay awake while I pulled him in." Lena nodded, her eyes bright with something between gratitude and awe. He told me about you. Said you went back into the storm 3 times that night. Said you were the only reason he saw his daughter born. She paused, her voice steady but heavy with meaning. That was me. The cafe was silent now. Even Greg, the owner, had stopped wiping the counter, his rag forgotten in his hand. Tara's phone was abandoned on the counter, her thumbs still hovering over the screen. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his confidence gone, his clipboard a useless shield. Lena turned to him, her gaze sharp as a blade. You just put your hands on a man who saved 14 people in one night, a man who kept this town's lighthouse burning when the rest of us were hiding from the wind. You might want to rethink how you treat someone wearing that patch. The officer mumbled, I'm sorry, ma'am. Sir. His face was red, his eyes on the floor. Elias waved a hand, dismissing it with the same quiet dignity he'd carried for decades. He's just doing his job, he said. Didn't know. That's the problem, Lena said, her voice firm but not unkind. Too many don't know. She looked at Elias, her expression softening. Will you walk with me? There's something you need to see. Elias hesitated, then nodded, his cap casting a shadow over his eyes. They stepped outside, the wind tugging at their clothes, the smell of seaweed and brine sharp in the air. The harbor stretched before them, dotted with fishing boats bobbing on the tide, the lighthouse standing sentinel at its edge. No one stopped them as they walked toward it, their steps slow but purposeful. The cafe patrons watched through the windows, some pulling out phones, not for selfies, but to capture something real, a moment that felt like history unfolding. Lena led him to the base of the lighthouse, where a small plaque had been mounted years ago, half covered in salt and moss, its edges worn by the sea air. It listed the names of the 73 storm survivors, etched in bronze. James Riley, Michael Dunn, Peter Cole. At the bottom, in smaller letters, Elias Carver, Keeper, for uncommon valor. Elias stared at it, his jaw tight, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He hadn't known it was there, hadn't even thought to look. All these years, he'd come to sit on the rocks below, never noticing the tribute above. You belong here, Lena said, her voice cutting through the wind. More than any of us. Elias didn't reply, but his fingers lingered on the plaque, tracing the letters of his name. For the first time that day, he smiled, just a fraction, the lines around his eyes deepening with the motion. Back at the Salty Gull, whispers had already started. Tara, the barista, had overheard enough to piece together who Elias was, and she'd told a regular, a lobsterman named Pete, who'd been a boy during the 73 storm. Pete's father had been one of the men Elias saved, pulled from the water just before hypothermia set in. By noon, the story had spread down the docks, from the fish market to the bait shop, carried on the wind like the scent of a coming storm. That's the Elias Carver, Pete told anyone who'd listen. The keeper who swam through hell to save my dad. By evening, Greg had made a call to the town historical society, his voice quieter than usual, a mix of shame and urgency. Lena had spoken to the mayor, her tone firm but respectful, her words leaving no room for excuses. No fanfare, she'd said. Just fix it. That night, Elias walked home along the coastal path, his boots crunching on gravel, the lighthouse fading into the dusk behind him. At the docks, a fisherman he'd known for years, a gruff man named Henry, gave him a nod. Heard about you today, Carver, he said, his voice rough but warm. Didn't know you were that guy. Elias shrugged, his hands in his pockets. Just kept the light on, he said, and kept walking, the wind at his back. At home, he lit the oil lamp on his kitchen table, its warm glow casting shadows on the walls. The sea was calm tonight, a rare thing, the waves a soft murmur against the cliffs. His house was small, sparse but tidy, the kind of place that felt lived in but not cluttered. A single bookshelf held a few weathered volumes, navigation charts, a history of Maine lighthouses, a dog-eared copy of Moby Dick. On the mantel, a photo in a cracked frame. Elias, younger, stronger, standing on the lighthouse steps with two other keepers, their faces wind-burned, their smiles wide. They'd all been there that night in '73, but only Elias had stayed in Pelican Point. The others had moved on, chasing calmer waters, but Elias couldn't leave. The sea was in his bones. A knock came at the door, soft, hesitant, almost lost in the sound of the waves. Elias opened it to find a teenage girl, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She held a yellowed newspaper clipping, the edges curling with age. "Mr. Carver," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My grandma said you saved her brother. I found this in her attic." She handed him the clipping. It was from 1973, a grainy photo of a younger Elias, soaked to the bone, standing on the rescue boat's deck, his face set with determination. The headline read, "Lighthouse Keeper Saves Dozen in Historic Storm." "My grandma said you never stopped, even when the boat started sinking," the girl said, her eyes wide. "She wanted you to have this." Elias took the clipping, his fingers steady, though his heart gave a quiet lurch. "Tell her I said thank you," he said, his voice softer now. The girl nodded and left, her sneakers scuffing the porch steps as she disappeared into the twilight. The next morning, a small sign appeared outside the Salty Gull. "To Elias Carver, our apologies. Your table is reserved." Inside, a corner booth by the window had a brass plate for the keeper. Elias didn't see it until noon, when he stopped by for his usual. Greg set down his coffee without a word, then added a slice of blueberry pie, the crust golden and flaky. "On the house," he said, his eyes not meeting Elias's, but his tone sincere. Elias nodded, accepting it without fuss, though he noticed the way the other patrons glanced his way, their whispers quieter now, tinged with respect. A week later, a letter arrived, handwritten on thick paper, the envelope sealed with a wax stamp. Elias Carver, Pelican Point Historical Society. It read, "We failed to honor you, not just for your service, but for your presence. You are welcome here, always. No questions asked. We'd like to hold a quiet gathering to recognize you, not for ceremony, but to say we see you. With respect, Margaret Cole, Director." Elias folded the letter and tucked it into his notebook, next to the list of names from '73. He didn't smile, but he nodded to himself, like he'd been waiting for the tide to turn, for the sea to give back what it had taken. That Friday, Lena returned, this time in civilian clothes, a wool sweater and jeans, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She met Elias at the cafe, where they sat over coffee and talked like they'd known each other for years, though they'd only met days before. "My father kept a journal," she said, stirring her coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the mug. "Wrote about the night you saved him. Said you tied a rope to your waist and dove in, even when the waves were breaking over the bow. He said you didn't hesitate, not once." Elias stirred his own coffee, the black liquid swirling in the cup. "James was the brave one," he said, his voice steady but distant, as if he were speaking to the sea itself. "Kept the others calm while I worked the winch, told them stories about his wife, his boat, anything to keep their minds off the cold. I was just the guy with the rope." Lena laughed softly, a sound like the chime of a buoy in the distance. "That rope held my whole family together," she said. "My mother was pregnant with me that night. She always said she felt me kick when Dad came home, like I knew he'd made it." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw James in her eyes, the same stubborn spark that had kept him alive in the water. "You've got his fight," he said, and Lena smiled, the kind of smile that carried a lifetime of gratitude. They talked for hours, the cafe emptying and filling around them, the light shifting from gray to gold as the sun broke through the clouds. Lena told him about her career in the Coast Guard, how her father's stories had pushed her to enlist, to serve the same waters that had nearly taken him. Elias listened, his hands wrapped around his mug, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, just a little. By Sunday, the Historical Society had set up chairs on the harbor green, a small patch of grass between the docks and the sea. No banners, just a single Coast Guard flag snapping in the breeze, its blue and white crisp against the sky. Elias tried to sit in the back, his cap pulled low, but Lena wouldn't have it. "You stood in the storm," she said, her hand on his shoulder. "You don't get to hide now." He wore his old peacoat, the Coast Guard patch freshly stitched by a neighbor who'd heard the story and insisted on helping. The crowd was small but real, fishermen with weathered faces, shopkeepers in flannel, a few kids from the high school history club, their notebooks clutched tight. A woman from the cafe brought a thermos of clam chowder, the steam rising in the cold air. A boy with a Polaroid camera snapped photos, not for clicks, but for keepsakes, his fingers trembling with excitement. Lena stood before the crowd, no notes, just her voice, clear and steady as a foghorn. "Some people carry the weight of a town without asking for thanks," she said, her eyes sweeping over the faces before her. "They don't shout about it. They don't need the spotlight. They just show up, year after year, storm after storm, keeping us safe when we didn't even know we needed them." She turned to Elias, her voice softening but no less firm. "When the sea took, you gave back. When we forgot, you remembered." She handed him a small box, cedar, polished smooth, the wood warm in her hands. Inside was a medallion, engraved, "For Elias Carver, Keeper of the Light, for valor that endures." Elias took it, his hand steady but his eyes distant, as if he were seeing the storm again, hearing the waves, feeling the cold. The crowd stood, one by one, not clapping, just standing, their silence a tribute louder than any applause. Because some moments don't need noise, they need witness. The next week, the cafe booth stayed reserved, a quiet monument to a man who'd never asked for one. Sometimes Elias sat there, his coffee steaming, his eyes on the lighthouse. Sometimes a student with a notebook would take the seat, asking about the storm, scribbling down every word. A fisherman left a carved wooden anchor on the table one day. No note, just a token of thanks. At the docks, people stopped calling him Old Carver. They just called him Elias, their voices carrying a new respect, a new recognition. When the high school invited him to speak at their Memorial Day assembly, Elias hesitated. "I'm no speaker," he said. But the history teacher, a young woman named Ms. Harper, no relation to Greg, sent a card signed by 15 students. "We don't want a legend. We want the truth." So he stood in the gym, no microphone, just his cap and his voice, the echo of his words filling the space. "I've been called a few things," he said, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. "Keeper, sailor, old man, nuisance." He let the word linger, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But it's not about names. It's about doing what needs doing, even when no one's watching. I didn't save those men for a medal. I saved them because they were out there, and I was the one who could get to them." The students listened, some taking notes, some just watching, their eyes wide. If someone in your life shows up day after day without asking for glory, see them, he said. That's what keeps a town afloat. That's what keeps us human. Winter came early to Pelican Point that year. The harbor froze at the edges, the ice creeping up the pilings, and Elias's porch light burned steady every night. He replaced the bulb himself, grumbling about salt air and rusty sockets, but it held, a beacon in the dark. People started dropping by. A neighbor with a thermos of hot cider, a kid with a question about the old rescue boats, a fisherman's widow who brought a knitted scarf and stayed for tea, her hands trembling as she told Elias how her husband had spoken of him until the day he died. The patrol officer, the one who'd grabbed his arm, came by one evening with his dad, a retired lobsterman named Tom. "My father knew you," Tom said, shaking Elias's hand, his grip firm despite his age. "Said you were the only one who'd go out in that storm. Said you saved his best friend, Pete's dad." Elias nodded, his eyes on the sea beyond the window. "Pete's dad was a fighter," he said. "Wouldn't let go of that line, even when his hands were frozen stiff." On the kitchen shelf, the medallion sat beside the photo of the 73 rescue crew, Elias at the helm, his face younger, but his eyes the same, steady, unyielding. He'd taped a note to the back. "Still here, still keeping." As the snow fell, blanketing the town in silence, Elias sat on his porch, coffee steaming, the lighthouse visible in the distance, its automated light a pale imitation of the one he'd kept alive. A girl on a bike stopped across the street, her scarf trailing in the wind. "Mr. Carver," she called, her voice bright in the cold. "My dad says you're the reason he's here." Elias raised his mug, the steam curling in the air. "Tell him he's the reason I kept going," he said, his voice carrying across the street. She grinned, then pedaled off, her laughter echoing as she disappeared around the bend. Elias leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under him, the sound a comfort after so many years. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a shadow, a forgotten piece of the town's history. He felt like home, a lighthouse in his own right, still burning, still guiding. If you believe quiet heroes still matter, subscribe and comment legacy below to keep their stories alive.